Okay, hello there, Pixel Pushers. Sadiq Hussain here with another Affinity photo tutorial. Now we're continuing with the tools, and we've made our way to the paintbrush. Now, the paintbrush, other than the crop tool, I think is probably the most commonly used, most popular tool in the toolbox. I'm fairly confident in saying that because you can do so much with it, and it's so inherent in all painting programs, editing programs. The paintbrush is the tool that you can use for many different tasks. Now, we can't possibly touch on all the main tasks, let alone all of the permutations, but we'll touch on just a handful of them. So here we can see I've done some text on here, but if I just remove the text, then the background is all done with different paintbrushes, different styles of paintbrush, different properties of the paintbrush. Even the border is with a paintbrush. So we'll look at those, and if I put on a different one, you can draw shapes with a paintbrush. You can put drop shadows onto that shape. You can, obviously it's limitless. And then we'll go on to looking at how you can use the paintbrush to replace color, but also we'll be looking at how we can draw specific graphics onto an image or paint another border that's got a very distinctive style to it, and that's all down to the type of paintbrush that you use. Okay, so let's start with the sort of easy to get your head around, which is essentially using it like a paintbrush on a blank canvas, on a blank sheet of paper, so to speak. So you can use it as a simple paintbrush. Now, so we have the paintbrush tool on the left, and if you click on the little arrow in the corner, you can see that it's got three parts to it. The paintbrush tool, which is the one that most people will use most of the time. The color replacement brush tool, which I don't use very often, but I'll just demonstrate it because there are other ways of replacing color using different tools within Affinity. And the pixel tool. Now, the pixel tool can be quite useful, and we'll demonstrate that as well. Okay, so let's just start from scratch on this thing, and what we're going to do is just roll that back to the beginning, and we'll just start building up what I've already shown you as the final product. So you got your tool, your brush, and then on the right hand side there's two other palettes that you need to be aware of that you'll be using in conjunction with the paintbrush tool. One is the brushes, obviously, so you've got all sorts of different styles of brushes, but if you click on that brushes palette, you've got lots of different categories of brushes. So you've got some inks, I've got some specific downloads here that you can get, paintbrush packs. Some are free, some are paid for, well worth looking into those. Markers, masking, mist and oils, pencils, pens, sprays, all sorts of things. So let's just look at sprays, for example. And to change the size of your brush, as we've said in other videos, just use the square bracket keys on your keyboard, or of course you can change the size of the brush just by going up to the top here and changing the width of it. Personally, I prefer just to use the square bracket keys, and to change that, let me just undo that. You can change it that way, or if you double click on any particular brush that you want to use, you bring up the brush properties. You can edit the brush properties. Now here you can go really crazy and edit. There's the size, obviously, there we go, smaller, larger brush size, but you can change all sorts of parameters, permutations of the brush, the hardness, the spacing. There's so many parameters you can change here. I would just try and experiment with these parameters, the rotation, and then you got dynamics and how the brush behaves. Again, we can't go into this in any great detail, but certainly well worth looking at it if you want to experiment with different types of painting. Okay, even the textures you can change. We're not going to look at textures today. Really, most people would keep it to the general and the dynamics. But you get to that dialog box just by double clicking the particular paintbrush that you're going to be using. So let's say we're using this spray brush. Double clicking, you get those parameters come up. You've got limited variables at the top here, but really to get to most of them you double click it. Okay, so if I want to paint, remember I'm painting with red here, so you've got the brushes palette that is important and the color palette. So this obviously determines what's the color that you're going to be painting with. Okay, so that was the spray brush. Again, if I increase the size of it, if we want it with wet edges, a bit like watercolors, we can do that. So as you keep painting on it, you can see that the edges behave differently compared to if you don't have wet edges. So it behaves more like a crayon or just paint on paint. But if you put wet edges on, then it sort of behaves as if it's a watercolor. Okay, and we'll take the wet edges off for now. And you can change the hardness of the brush, which really is talking about the edge of the brush. How hard an edge does it have? Obviously it depends on the style of brush that you've chosen as well. If you've chosen a very soft brush, that won't really manifest itself. But if we went to inks, for example, and chose that brush, again increase the size of it, and if we increase the hardness to 100%, then when you paint with it, it's got a harder edge. But if we reduce the hardness right down, and then paint with it, you'll notice that the edge itself is not quite as hard. Okay, let's just, and then the flow is about how much ink or paint is there on the brush. So if you've got 100% flow, it means that the paintbrush is loaded with lots of ink. But if you reduce the flow, then you have less ink on the brush. Okay, so that's a thicker stroke, and that's more of a less intense stroke. Okay, so you can change those parameters as well. Let's just wind that back for a second and choose a different brush. Let's say a acrylic, and choose that brush. Change the size of it again. We'll change the color to a deep red, a maroon color. And if I wanted to paint a border, I'll just click in the corner, and depending on the style of brush, now you can do it freehand if you want to, like I'm doing now, and that gives it more of an organic style to it. Obviously, if you make a mistake, just go back on the history palette and just draw down again. Freehand can work quite well, like that. But if you don't want to do it freehand and you want to do it in straight lines, just keep the shift key pressed on your keyboard and click, and then click again, and it'll draw a straight line there. Now if it does that, then just rewind it back, and if I keep the shift key pressed, click and drag, it paints in a straight line. So shift key and that'll paint in a straight line, and that's actually good to keep that kind of border, or to try that kind of a border using. It really depends on the style of brush that you use. See here, you see we've got some gaps in that brush, so it's leaving some drag marks, so to speak. Okay, so there's lots of things you can do just with simply painting, depending on the style of brush that you use. Again, let's look at dry media. Let's look at something like a bit like chalk, and change the color again, just so you can see, and again the size, and maybe we want to Okay, we could just draw like that randomly. And if you wanted to actually draw a shape that you can manipulate, if I just put a new layer on here, so it's on a new layer, and we just loosely paint like a square and colour that in. It's got some splatter marks because of the style of brush that I've used. If I click on the move tool now, which is the move, resize and reshape tool, I can now change the size of that graphic, if you like, change all sorts of parameters to it, add any effects that I want to it. For example, just like you can with anything else, maybe I want an outer shadow, and I can do that, offset that shadow. So straight away I've got, with a simple paintbrush, I've created a graphic that I can then just copy and paste that anywhere I want to onto another photograph, just doing Control or Command and C and Control or Command and V to paste it into another document. So that's very simply the use of the paintbrush as a paintbrush. Now, if we come to here, just any picture with a bit of color in it, and if I go to click on the paintbrush tool, go to pixel tool, this essentially allows you to change individual pixel colors. So you need to zoom right in until you get to see, you can see the individual pixels. Now whichever color you choose, you can then color each pixel. So if you really want to fine tune, let's say red eye, and you don't want to do it automatically, even though Affinity has got a built-in red eye removal tool, if you wanted to do it individual pixels, you can do that. Remember, pixels are square, so you can do each square at a time to whatever color you want to do. So that's really neat, that pixel replacement tool. I can see that being used particularly when you're doing some fine editing. Okay, now if we just quickly look at the color replacement, now personally I don't think this works as well as other methods, but maybe there are applications that viewers know. You can let me know in the comments where it does work really well. So I'm now on the color replacement tool, and what it essentially does is whatever color you've got selected in your color swatch, it will replace it with that color wherever you click it. So here it's orange, so if I click here and then paint with it, oh, I need a different style brush really, don't need dry media. We'll go to basic brushes, sort of general brushes, and we'll go for with a soft edge, reduce the size of it. Okay, so what we're doing is telling the software to replace those orange pixels, because that's where I'm clicking with the mouse. So I'm clicking and painting with the mouse, and I'm getting it to replace it with, in this case, green. But you can specify what you want to do, replace it with. You'll notice that you've got to click several times, because at each point then the nature of the pixel that you're sampling, the orange at the background, does vary, and so it's got to sample that each time. But with a bit of patience you can actually paint the pixels out quite effectively, but I personally don't use it very often in this format. Again, whichever tool you've got selected, you've got opacity, flow, hardness, and you might want to change that as well. And there's a couple of other parameters there that you might want to look into. But clearly what you'd need to do it carefully and change the pixels that way around. Okay. Now let's go on to the third major application, which is if you want to paint a graphic onto a picture itself or paint a border here. So let's just roll this back to the starting point. And again, if you want to use the paintbrush now, so we're going to use the regular paintbrush again. And let's say I'm going to use just a regular paintbrush there, and I want to paint a laser beam coming out of the AT-AT vehicle onto the guy at the front. And really we got to look at how we're going to paint that. Now, what color do we want it? We want it to be red. We want to go from here down to here. You could do it freehand, of course, just by painting down like that. That's not going to look very effective. So what you could do, the opacity is right. Layer, that's fine. What you could do is, again, change the size of the brush. You don't want it to be too big. And then click where you roughly want to start from. Hold the shift key and then click once. And then if it doesn't make a straight line to where you want it to, then just click a second time. So I'll do it again. So left shift key pressed on the keyboard. Now, if it does that, it's because it's taken that as the starting point. So let me just go back. So I clicked once, then moved it to where I wanted it, then press the shift key and click the mouse again. So that paints a straight line. Okay, so now that's red. If we want to paint white in the middle to give it that laser beam effect, we zoom in a bit and we can put that in. Again, click it once, hold the shift key and then click again. And again, it will do the same thing. Shift key, second click, and straight away you've got the laser beam effect there. Now, what that laser beam looks like depends on lots of things. One is the style of brush that you've used. One is the opacity of the brush, the flow, the hardness. So all of these make a difference to what that looks like. Okay. You might want it to be in 4 lasers rather than 2. So again, if I just roll that back, and this time if I draw a new pixel layer, create a new pixel layer, still on the paintbrush, and I'll just draw one laser beam. We'll start with red, start there, shift key pressed, and we'll just do the one, and then we go to white, reduce the size of it so it's inside, click shift key and where I want the straight line to end. And if I just do that one, press the move tool, so now I've got that, I can position that wherever I want, but actually what I want to do is replicate it. So Control and C or Command and C, and then Command and V. Yes, I should have done Command and V. And so that's replicated it. And if I wanted to do that again, so now I've got 4 versions. I can position them exactly where I want and move them as well if I wanted to. See get the exact position. There's another one here. Now what I could do is to make these a bit, by pulling that, it actually makes them a little bit wider, because as something comes nearer to you, it becomes a bit bigger. So you can play with the perspective, obviously, and work that out. You can even give that more of an outer glow if you wanted to. This, I'm just showing you the principle. Fine-tuning it is really down to spending time and experimenting with the tool. Okay, and if you think, oh, that's actually a bit too opaque, we want it to be semi-transparent, select them all, shift key, select them all, or just command and click each layer at a time. And now if I just reduce the opacity of those layers, now you can see we can change, and you probably don't want it 100%, because you'll find that laser beams tend to be a little bit see-through. You can decide. And straight away we've got a graphic overlay. Now you might want to fine-tune these, obviously, and get them exactly right, but this is again just the principle of it. If I want to put a border on it like we did before, again, paintbrush tool, choose an appropriate brush, maybe an oil brush. Let's just try that one. That might look quite good. Change the size of it. And again, I'm going to use the shift, click once, shift, and click again. And that paints a straight line. Because of the style of brush that we're using, there's that randomness to it, which is great actually. It works really well. And there we go. So, and you could obviously paint over it a second time if you want. Oh, no, that's not what we wanted to do. Let's just go back. You might want to paint over it a second time. Okay. And then finally, if you wanted to put a key line round it, this is not using the brush, but I'll show you because you saw it on the original image at the head of the video. If you click on the shape tool, make sure you got the rectangle shape and just click and draw. Don't worry about what we've just drawn here. It's the color. We just draw it roughly where you want it. Then what we do is to click on the fill, and we take out the fill completely. Click on the stroke. What color stroke do we want? We want it to be black. What size of stroke do we want? At the moment it's on 7 pixels, but you know, we could change it. And then also, what kind of corner do you want? Let's give it a concave corner. That's quite large, so we just change the percentage here at the top, and we can reduce it and say maybe there. And click on the move tool, and that allows us to move and position it, center it, because we got the crosshairs, because we've got the magnetic snapping tool enabled, which you've seen in other videos. And there's a border, a key line done, as well as some application of a paintbrush. So you can see the different things that a paintbrush can do. Look at that border compared to that laser graphic. Look at what we can do there. And how we can replace pixels as well, either on an individual basis or on a whole color basis. So that's a very quick tour of what the the paintbrush tool can do. And it's got 3 components, 3 different paintbrush tools, but the one that we're using the most of is the paintbrush tool there. Just remember that's used in conjunction with not just the context menu at the top here, but also the brushes menu, which is key, and also the color swatch as well. And when I do a video on creating text and watermarks and signatures and copyright stamps, then we'll be making a custom brush using text and then saving that, and then actually it appears in the brushes palette. I've got some custom ones here already, just up here, and there's various ones in here: flowers, grass, other organic things, as well as text as well. So we'll be coming onto that in a future video. If there's any other applications of using the paintbrush that you know of that you can contribute to the community, do put it into the comments, and I'll have a read of those and try and implement some of those. If not, give this a try and watch the video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Thank you very much, and hope you enjoyed it and found it useful. Thank you.